What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the new Samsung Galaxy A16 5G. Now, this is the successor, of course, to last year's A15 5G, and it's the continuation of what's basically been the best-selling tier of Samsung smartphone for like the last 4 or 5 years now, at least. Ever since the A11 or A12, people have realized that they can get a really solid Samsung smartphone with the same great Android experience and Samsung ecosystem with One UI, with powerful enough specs and plenty of decent features too, all for a fraction of the price of an S-series device. And for 2025, I suspect this new A16 5G will once again be a bestseller, but there are a couple of things with this new phone that people might still be a little grumpy about. Samsung did remove the headphone jack, for one, and the design with those chunky black borders framing the display, well, they keep this phone looking a bit budgety for yet another year. But for under $200, I'm still of the opinion that this is likely going to be a great buy for a vast majority of price-conscious people. Before we get into everything that's new with the A16, let me just quickly show you what comes inside the box, and it's not much. Slicing into it here and sliding off the lid, the first thing you get is the phone itself, all wrapped up nicely, and there's actually nothing else inside the bottom half of the box, but stuck inside the lid you will see the familiar Samsung stamped cardboard packet. There's a SIM ejector tool on the outside, and then the only accessories inside the package are a single USB-C cable and a stack of paperwork. That's all that's included nowadays with these smartphones. But if I can make one quick suggestion, if you haven't already, get yourself a couple 25-watt fast-charging USB-C power bricks. This phone, and most other Samsung phones, support these faster charging speeds. And since Samsung doesn't give you the proper accessory anymore, you may as well get them yourself and take advantage of the fast-charging feature you essentially pay for anyway in buying this phone. So here is the new A16 5G once again, and I first want to talk about pricing and availability because some of you might already be typing away in the comments saying, didn't this phone come out months ago in like late 2024? And yeah, that's technically true. The A16 5G quietly launched internationally at the end of October, but here in the US, Samsung only just announced this phone this week for a January 9th release date. With this more formal announcement and launch, you're now going to start seeing this phone sold everywhere. From Samsung directly, from major carriers and prepaid networks. And while the full retail price is technically $199 right now, I do have a couple suggestions to help save you some money. At the moment, Samsung is offering a bundle deal of sorts. If you buy the new A16 from them, they'll give you a Galaxy Fit 3 smartwatch for 50% off. Not a huge savings, but saving 20 or 30 bucks on a decent smartwatch if you were maybe going to buy one at some point anyway is still something to consider. Depending on how flexible you are with your smartphone carrier, you'll probably be able to get this phone for free or at a steep discount if you add a new line, switch providers, or do some sort of trade-in. This is one of those phones that's just always offered at some sort of deal or discount from them. And third-party sellers on Amazon, for example, are already knocking the price down on this phone quite a bit. I'll leave links to these different deals down below in the video description if you want to shop around. So while this new A16 5G certainly looks like the many other A-series phones of previous years, Samsung says this phone has some awesome features, and I actually want to touch on what they say about this phone and offer my own commentary on top of it to further clarify if these highlights are new, unique, or just marketing jargon. First and foremost, Samsung says this phone features an upgraded 6.7-inch Super AMOLED display with Vision Booster. Now, it is true that the display was upgraded specifically in size. Last year, the A15 5G was 6.5 inches, but Samsung has sort of stayed within the 6.5 to 6.7 inch range for all these A-series phones, and I've never felt that an extra tenth of an inch in either direction makes much of a difference. But hey, bigger is usually better, and at this size, it's about as big as you can get. The Super AMOLED panel itself, however, doesn't seem to be any different from last year. It's still a 2340 by 1080 resolution, 90Hz refresh rate display with a maximum peak brightness of around 800 nits. Vision Booster is an outdated term that Samsung used to use on their S22s that today is just another name for adaptive brightness. Basically, the phone will get as bright as possible when the ambient light sensor detects a super bright condition, like in direct sunlight outdoors, for example. And all Samsung phones have done that for years. Visually, nothing else here is really different or better with the overall viewing experience, but that's not to say that the screen looks bad. In fact, This is a great looking, very bold and colorful OLED display for the price, and because it's so big, all your content is going to look pretty good. With 90Hz enabled, you also have that smooth scrolling and faster touch response that's not quite as good as the flagship 120Hz refresh rate, but it's a nice middle ground for still getting a little something. Besides all that, I think more people will just be a little more bummed about the fact that the screen-to-body ratio on this phone still isn't great. The thick black borders, bulky bottom chin, and dated selfie camera notch make the phone look cheaper, and really, you just have a lot of excess device in your hand. I would imagine at this point that more people would have preferred slimmer bezels and a camera cutout like the higher-tier A-series phones have as the actual screen upgrade, but I think this old-school display design helps Samsung keep the costs lower for this phone. Samsung calls the A16 simply sophisticated, with a redesigned frame and back cover that's sleek and functional, but it's mostly the same as last year. This phone is all plastic all around, from its glossy back cover to the color-matched edges. It's a great looking phone from the back, in my opinion. It looks exactly like the higher tier A-series and even the S-series phones, really, but it's arguably not any different than before. There are two subtle changes, though, that are worth noting. The first thing, which you probably saw already, Samsung ditched the headphone jack on this phone now. So there's just a big blank covered spot where it once was. RIP. And the other change is, durability-wise, the A16 is now IP54 dust and splash resistant. So not fully waterproof exactly, but theoretically a little tougher than the uncertified previous A15. What Samsung didn't add, though, tragically, is a dual speaker setup. This A16 still only has the one single downward-facing speaker at the bottom, and while it's okay on its own, I feel like a secondary speaker in the earpiece couldn't possibly have put Samsung over the edge cost-wise, and it would have been a nice addition. As far as everything else, physically, nothing else has really changed. Buttons are all in the same spot. Fingerprint sensor is still the power button, which is fine. I actually prefer this, I think. It's just easier and more reliable most of the time. Fortunately, Samsung also still retained microSD card support on this phone, which surprisingly, they do advertise as a feature here. I think most people will have a 128GB model available to them. That's what I have here. And you can see about 23 gigs of that is taken up by Android and all of Samsung's pre-installed apps. One of the included perks, by the way, of buying this phone is free Samsung TV Plus and 2 months of YouTube Premium, but a lot of these apps can be deleted. And more importantly, you can just go out and get yourself a 256 or 512GB SD card for pretty cheap and have plenty of storage to work with. When it comes to the processor and performance, you actually have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of this page to see what Samsung has to say. And all they do say is that this phone features a powerful octa-core processor. The processor itself in name is Samsung's own Exynos 1330 here in the US, or the MediaTek Dimensity 6300 if you have the international version of the phone. Both are octa-core processors, and here are the Geekbench numbers, so you have some data to go off of. But here's the cold hard truth on this. The Exynos 1330 is actually more than 2 years old now. It was first used inside the M14, which came out in early March 2023 for the international market. And the MediaTek 6300, while it is an upgrade over the 6100 Plus from the A15, it's almost a year old itself, too. So there's nothing new or upgraded with the processors here, unfortunately. They're just a slightly more powerful chip that's otherwise been out for a while and used in some other smartphones for the past couple of years. This isn't a bad thing necessarily. It's just one more way in which Samsung can cut costs and keep this phone as cheap as possible. Performance-wise, I've always felt that this tier of A-series is sort of that bare minimum if you want a solid device that can still tackle 90% of your daily tasks and asks. There's 4, 6, and 8GB RAM options for this phone. I think 6 gigs is what you'll find for sale in most places, and that's what I would opt for personally. This phone can game, it can multitask, and it isn't going to stutter through the basic tasks like most super budget phones might do. But you have to remain realistic with your expectations. This is a more simple smartphone for the easy everyday stuff. Just staying connected with friends and family, browsing social media, enjoying your usual streaming apps and other content. If that's mainly what you do on your phone day in and day out, that's mainly what this tier of A series will be good at. One thing Samsung doesn't actually explicitly advertise, at least on their main product page, that they absolutely should, is the fact that this phone will now receive 6 years of One UI and Android software updates, alongside 6 years of security updates. This is the longest amount of software support of a cheap A series device yet, and I love this because it means your $200 can go really far now. This is a phone that will remain current with the latest Samsung stuff for years to come. And since so few people upgrade their phones every year, or even every other year now, you can rest easy knowing Samsung isn't going to abandon you on the software side anytime soon. Samsung also has a big fancy graphic showing that this phone has a seemingly big 5,000 mAh battery powering it as well. But I hate to ruin the illusion, every A-series phone from the last few years has had the same 5,000 mAh battery inside. That's still a ton of juice though, don't get me wrong. I've always been able to get 8 to 10 hours of screen on time with a phone like this easily. And I suspect it's much of the same for this new A16. Like I mentioned earlier, you'll also want to just get yourself the right power brick to pair with it, and then you're good to go. You'll be charging fast, lasting long, and probably going a full day without having to worry about being plugged in. Finally, Samsung says you can capture moments like never before with 3 lenses around back for picture-perfect memories, and a 13-megapixel selfie camera up front. Altogether, however, this camera setup seems to be the exact same hardware from last year's A15. The triple lens cameras include a 50-megapixel f1.8 aperture main shooter, a 5-megapixel ultra-wide lens, and a 2-megapixel macro for up-close pics. The 13-megapixel selfie camera appears to be the same as well, and inside the camera app, Samsung hasn't added anything more here that we haven't already seen to improve, enhance, or otherwise change the picture-taking experience. While you do get some super useful stuff like the wide-angle lens, and a dedicated night mode, and slow-mo and hyperlapse and panorama, and a 50-megapixel photo mode too, you don't have 4K video recording still, you don't have any better zoom beyond 10x digital. What I always say is that compared to everything else, camera setup and features are what's furthest behind an S-series or flagship phone on these A-series phones. And that's still the case once again this year. The pictures this phone captures still kind of look a little over-processed. They still lack a little bit of detail. None of this is new, none of this is a surprise. It's just something I always like to stress because Samsung and the other smartphone companies stress camera stuff so heavily themselves on their flagship phones, these budget phones are still quite a ways behind. So looking past Samsung's own fluff and jargon, what's actually new with the new A16 5G? Well, you get a bigger screen for enjoying your content, but you'll need a wireless pair of earbuds to enjoy it, or reluctantly listen to the same single speaker setup out loud. The processor inside is a little better than last year, but not anything new. You can keep this phone for an additional couple of years, since Samsung will still keep feeding it updates. But overall, to me, this feels like a pretty minor refresh versus an outright upgrade. What do you guys think? Is the new A16 5G a phone you're considering for this year? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.